I was out of town just recently and actually recorded what was meant to be this video, and I decided to erase it. I felt like I rambled a little bit too much in the beginning. I always take with me on my business trips a game book, usually a D&D book, because I have more of those than any others, and read them in the evenings when I'm done with whatever I'm doing on my business trip and I'm sitting around in the hotel. I've already eaten dinner, already showered, kind of gotten ready for bed, but not ready to go to sleep and lights out yet. And I brought Sandstorm, which is an environmental book from the 3.5 era. It's a little disappointing. The 3.5 era, by this point, had kind of devolved into just choking us under the weight of tedious and ridiculous rules for all kinds of things that, as far as I can tell, really nobody ever used for anything. And it's really kind of a shame, because when D20 first launched in 2000 as 3rd edition, one of its two mottos was tools, not rules. And it was meant to be used more like a toolkit rather than a very prescriptive rule set. And that motto very quickly rotted away, and it became, in fact, an incredibly overly complicated, overly detailed rule set, and the motto became rules, rules, and more rules rather than tools. And I don't know, maybe that's not very fair to the designers. Maybe they meant it to be a toolkit, but it doesn't really work out that way. I say this because D20, when it was also new, was kind of marketed as a system that could do anything. And not only was it, of course, the system of 3rd edition D&D, it was also the system of D20 Modern, which was kind of a generic, quote-unquote, system for all kinds of games, both modern and future, and past, for that matter. There's a D20 Past supplement that specifically meant to be used for pulp era, 19th century, all kinds of things, Gaslight, all the way back to Pirates and Musketeers. I actually thought D20 Modern would have been great as an alternative rule set for fantasy that was less overtly D&D-ish. D20 was also used for a Star Wars game, a Wheel of Time game, and perhaps most curiously, for a Call of Cthulhu game, which was made as a joint effort between Wizards of the Coast and Chaosium. And that's actually what I want to talk about today, is the Call of Cthulhu game, which is what I'm probably going to read when I'm done with Sandstorm, which is really the one that I should have brought with me all along. Now, a lot of people don't feel, for whatever reason, the D20 Call of Cthulhu game does the game justice. And I'm kind of here to debunk, I guess, maybe that point of view. And I've got 3 points that I want to make, maybe 4, because I'm not quite sure exactly why people think that. I know what they say sometimes, but what they say and what is actually real don't really match up. So I think part of it just comes down to people who have played Call of Cthulhu for a long time expect it to play a certain way, to have a certain system, and to just kind of be what it is. And when it's different, it just feels off to them. And I totally get that. One of the things that they complain about D20 is that, of course, being based on the same system as D&D, it doesn't really have classes, but it does have levels, and it does have a lot of stuff that goes along with that. And I have always kind of liked those, and I recognize why people who don't like them don't. I get it. But I've played more games with levels than not, and I'm very comfortable with them, and I just kind of like them. So I freely admit that that's not a rational or a reasonable preference. It's just one that I have because I have it. So if somebody doesn't like D20 just because it doesn't feel enough like Call of Cthulhu to them, I totally get it. But if they're saying that it doesn't actually do justice to the theme and the tone of what Call of Cthulhu is supposed to be about, now that I disagree with. I do think a lot of people also believe that D20 equals D&D, and therefore, if you're playing in the same system, you have to play it as if it were D&D, and you have to play it like D&D. This is probably my first point. I think this is not a reasonable claim to make. Call of Cthulhu by Chaosium in its original system is a basic role-playing system. It uses the exact same system that they developed first for RuneQuest and Stormbringer, both of which are high fantasy adventure games, although their system is very different than D&D. Their their theme and their tone is exactly the same. So Call of Cthulhu in either the BRP system or the d20 system is based on a high fantasy adventure game. That's equally true for both of them. So if you think that d20 is, by its very nature, too high fantasy and adventurous, and BRP is not, that is simply not true, because BRP was developed, again, for RuneQuest and for Stormbringer, which is a game based on Michael Moorcock's Elric saga, which is, of course, also one of the quite notable influences of D&D itself. The second point is that people think that with levels, I think that by nature your character is going to progress into a powerhouse that fights toe-to-toe with Cthulhu or whatever. This is also quite ridiculous of an assertion. Wizards of the Coast have twice, once in the 3rd edition era, and I can't remember exactly when, it was quite a while ago now, and then more recently in the 5th edition era, have released some of their research data on the play habits of their player base, which suggested that even in D&D, hardly any campaigns got past 7th level in a game that goes up to 20th, in theory, right? Like the Call of Cthulhu game also, for that matter, in theory goes up to 20. But even in D&D itself, nobody plays, well, I want to say nobody, rarely does anybody play a campaign that goes above 7th level. From a system standpoint, you could actually quite easily, and this is a debatable point, but I think it's true, you could make a case that low-level D20 Call of Cthulhu investigators are actually weaker and more fragile than their BRP counterparts. And this would be true for, I don't know, levels 1 through 3 maybe. And then you could make a case that for levels 4 or 5, maybe 6, that they're more or less equivalent to BRP investigators. And BRP investigators do progress and get better at certain things over time, assuming that they survive. So that's why levels 4 through 6, maybe 6, kind of are equivalent to them, the 4th level being kind of starting characters and 6th level being ones that have been around for a while. BRP was quite notable, in fact, for pointing out that characters who managed to really jack up their dodge skill and have it increase over time as they played got to the point where they were almost impossible to hit, and they could dodge just about anything coming at them, and they were incredibly anti-fragile by using their dodge skill. This, of course, there's no equivalent to that in D20, but, you know, by the time your characters get up to 6th level, they have more hit points, they have better base attack bonus, they have better saving throws, they probably don't have better AC, but they are better and less fragile. If your characters in D20 Call of Cthulhu are 7th level or higher, I don't really know what to tell you. I don't know why you would ever have a character that high when even in D&D that's unusual. Why would you go higher level than that in D20? If you're complaining about the theory that 15th level Call of Cthulhu investigators are quite capable, you've got nobody but yourself to blame for that. Why in the world would you ever be playing a 15th level investigator? Why would you ever, in fact, play an investigator higher than 4th or 5th level? I don't understand why a campaign would ever go higher than that in D20. I did check because I actually don't remember, but in D20 Call of Cthulhu you do level up, similar to D&D with XP, but there's also a section where it talks about leveling up, where it says if you want a more pulpy adventure feel, you can level up faster, but if you want a more grim horror feel, which I think a lot of people who complain about this probably do, there's a rule right in there where it says then slow down your leveling, give less XP. In fact, it even says you can play without ever leveling up at all, where your character just remains a first level schmuck for an entire campaign. It's addressed in the rules. I don't understand why people don't understand that particular thing, and they feel like just the fact that there's levels means that your character has to be more adventurous. Nothing else about the characters or the system makes them more adventurous than their BRP equivalents would be, other than the potential, I guess, of playing at higher level. But again, there's really no reason you ever should play a Call of Cthulhu investigator at high level. The third point I want to make is that in reality, what most people think the themes and tones of Lovecraft are are not very consistent, and people say, oh, it's a game of bleak horror with insignificant characters and humanity is insignificant. And it is true that sometimes this is a theme of some of Lovecraft's stories, but it is not always a theme of all of his stories, including of many of his most iconic ones. I'm thinking in particular here of, for example, the Dunwich Horror, which is probably out of all the things he wrote, I would say it's definitely in the top half dozen or so of most iconic of his stories. Wilbur Whateley, the half-human, half-monstrous kind of main character for much of the game, or much of the story, is like this 7-foot-tall, hulking monstrosity in mostly human form, supposed to be very strong, supposed to be very precocious, supposed to have magical powers from his otherworldly father, and yet he's killed by a dog. And I get it, dogs can be kind of mean, but that's a little underwhelming, let's just say. At the end of the story, his half-brother, who is much more monstrous than he is, kind of starts rampaging around the countryside, and about half dozen or so, maybe a little less, old professors who happen to have knowledge of some magic themselves go out to the countryside and cast their spell and banish him or destroy him. They quite literally go out and do battle with evil and are successful at doing so by using magic themselves. All of the elements of that denouement are counter to what people claim the themes of Lovecraft are, and yet there it is, right there in one of his most iconic stories. In Call of Cthulhu itself, probably the most iconic story, and the one that gave its name to the game. Cthulhu was sent packing when an old sailor in a dumpy old tub of a boat thumps him on the head, and he completely dissolves. And it makes some vague comments about him reforming, but in fact, he does not reform, and his island sinks back under the sea, and that's the end of that. It is simply not true that going out and facing the horrors of the mythos is anti-Lovecraftian. In fact, in many of his stories, that is exactly what happens. And in some of them, to be fair, some of them are more overtly horrible. If you think about, for example, Shadows over Innsmouth, that's one that has kind of both. The guy escapes from this town that's overrun by these creepy fish people, but at the end, there's kind of a little coda where it says the government drops a bunch of depth charges under the sea and blows up the fish people city. So, they win. And then the horrible element, of course, is that the guy at the end reveals that he is also a descendant of these fish people and will eventually turn into one himself, and in fact is doing so already as the story ends. I think a lot of people have this idea that this bleak kind of nihilistic theme and tone is Lovecraftian, and sometimes it is, but sometimes it isn't. And if you go beyond Lovecraft himself into many of the other writers who wrote mythos stories, and Robert E. Howard in particular is one that stands out here. He quite often has fairly savvy and capable action-y type heroes who face down elements of the mythos. And sometimes Robert E. Howard doesn't either. In his story, The Black Stone, for example, it's very Lovecraftian in tone. And by that I mean what people think Lovecraftian is. But I think that's part of the problem, too, is that when people say D20 is ill-suited for Lovecraftian themes, they not only don't understand the D20 system, which I've talked about in the first two, but they don't understand Lovecraft's themes either. And this is kind of what my third point is. My fourth point is that the BRP game is itself not necessarily super good at those themes and doesn't always follow them. Most of the iconic campaigns that are written for it, especially Mask of Nyarlathotep, which is probably the most iconic campaign for that game, is frequently compared to Indiana Jones or like a 1920s James Bond running around the world participating in all these kind of action adventures. So this thematic consistency, I guess, just simply doesn't exist. It's not actually a factor of Call of Cthulhu, the game as it's known in BRP. No, it's not part of that game. It's not part of Lovecraft. It is, I take that back, it is part of them, but it is not the totality of either the game or of Lovecraft, either one. And frankly, the D20 system, especially if you keep it at lower levels, is perfectly capable of emulating that theme In fact, in some ways, it probably does so better than BRP itself does. Like I said earlier, I think very low-level d20 characters, especially the Call of Cthulhu characters, which have a lower hit die and much lower benefits and abilities in general, they're probably weaker on average relative to, the threats that they will face in the system than BRP investigators are. It's only at 4th, 5th, 6th levels that they kind of become equivalent. I would agree that 7th level and higher investigators in D20 would probably be more powerful than most BRP characters, but again, if you're playing at that high level, when even D&D doesn't hardly ever get to that level, you've got nobody to blame but yourself. I highly recommend the D20 Call of Cthulhu book. It is literally my favorite game book of all game books ever published. It's got great advice, it's got great lore and mythos stuff in it, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful book. If you can find it, and I do see used copies occasionally for sale at a reasonable price, although I also see them unavailable or only available at a very high price quite often. But if you can get it, I highly recommend it. I think it's a great book. And if you don't want to play D20 Call of Cthulhu because you're super happy with BRP, that's perfectly fine. I'm not saying that you should play D20, but I'm saying you shouldn't write off D20 and make claims about it that actually aren't true. It is not ill-suited for the Call of Cthulhu game, its theme, or its tones.